Hello, my name is Dan Hennen. Today is May 3rd, 2019, and we'll be doing a broadcast about an officer-involved shooting in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, where an Australian woman was killed. Joining me on the broadcast today will be Greg Fernandez Jr. via Skype, and he's from California, and I'd like to get his some various thoughts on his. He's joined me before on many other episodes and broadcasts. Welcome to the show, Greg.
Hey, Dan. Nice to be here.
So this case here happened right in my backyard, but for you, it's you're out in California, and the first thing I'd like to know about this case is what kind of media attention nationally has it drawn, and how has it been perceived, a case like this, out in your neck of the woods? The reason we're doing the show today also is the settlement from the civil case was just announced today, so I'm sure that's been all over your news out there as well, but Let's start off with that. What's the perception or the reception like about this case on a national level?
It's like a media blackout. I'm not seeing a lot of people talking about it. I see local stuff. Of course, every major company has picked this up, but as far as over here in California, I don't know anybody that's talking about it except us, except me and maybe you and a couple other people. But so I was kind of shocked by that. Especially because we're talking about, the subject of murder, not only murder of a woman by a cop, of an unarmed woman. It just gets deep. So I was shocked that this hasn't been a bigger story, at least out here, with all this women's rights stuff going on in California. But I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's pretty big. Here, but I think when it first went down, the angle was, and even today, reading some of the comments on some of these articles, the race baiting, I think, is included. You get the man versus the female. You get the Somali Muslim killing a white Australian unarmed woman, and it's a officer-involved shooting. It's the woman dies. She's unarmed. You've got a whole potpourri of things to go after for these people that are wanting to debate things and escalate things. But if you bring it down to the raw, bare bones, what we have here, regardless of the skin color, religion, or race, you've got an actual police officer, shooting a woman who's unarmed while he's sitting in a police car, and shooting across his driver of the car because he's in the passenger seat, shooting, striking, and killing this woman, and all the while neither of them had their badge video camcorders or their body cams even turned on. So we had this whole thing leading up to this case, and it took place back in 2017. This is July of 2017 that this took place outside of Minneapolis, and it came on the heels of a couple other large nationwide officer-involved shootings, and also officer-involved shootings here in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. So that's, I think, why it grabbed further attention here, that it really spiked. And also in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, we have a high, large immigration rate, Somali rate of immigration. So that also took a spin because Officer Mohammed Noor, is of a Somali background. And so it brings in all these other scenarios that come into play, and it really gets what I think, just looking at it, my own opinion is people sidetracked on going through the wrong issues, going down the wrong path, fighting the wrong fires, and fighting the distraction of
they're
all.
They're trying to make it all about race, right? It's all
Correct.
just a racist thing, or they're not just focused on a cop shot an unarmed person. Even all these people who are always talking about cops doing all of these bad things, here you have a clear case, and you have justice. We finally get a case that has justice, and I haven't seen that in a long time. And to be honest, I was shocked. I was happily shocked, but I was shocked that we got just some type of justice in this case.
I was when the announcement came, and I'll bring up the page here on the actual criminal case. That was April 30th, so just last week. And like I said earlier, this shooting took place in July of 2017, and the reason it took so long is that Officer Noor, who did the shooting, did not speak did not give an interview. He basically lawyered up, did not talk to his bosses, his superiors, anyone in the law enforcement in his department, and didn't talk to anybody. And so no one even got answers from the very beginning. So he kind of went into seclusion essentially, but he was also placed on administrative leave and then kept receiving a paycheck. And so once they did this initiation, then this is the kind of thing that really gets people aggravated, is things like that.
You just said that he didn't talk. Did his bosses talk? Was any of the other cops? Was anybody else talking? Was everybody else cooperative except for this guy?
Well, I think they were cooperative, but no one knew what happened except for Noor, the shooter, who was in the passenger side, and the officer Harity, who was the driver, who was a white officer, also only been on the force a couple of years. So between the two of them, I think they had 4 years of combined service. Noor was a rookie cop, I believe, in his first year, maybe even his second, and Harity was in his second or third year himself. So both were very young. So no one knew the story, and the frustration with this from the general public, like myself, is that we never got the truth of what happened. And so all we heard then is that he was going to lawyer up, and this investigation was going to take weeks and months and everything else to get it all solved. But yet, as the public, like for you and I out there, we're thinking what investigation needs to take place. What exactly forensics needs to take place? We know that he shot the gun. It was his service pistol. The bullet that killed her was his bullet. The casing that was there was his. We don't need fingerprints. We don't need forensics. We don't need analysis. We don't need an investigation. He did the shooting. She subsequently died. She was unarmed. What else is there to investigate? What could possibly have taken this long? So then we get into the bystanders, who was there and everything else. There only was one person, a young boy riding his bicycle through at that time, and then saw what happened and stopped his bike and started recording with his video. Now later in the testimony it shows that he did admit to smoking marijuana that night, and he had 4 shots of whiskey, and he was underage. So he really, that's why he didn't want to talk, because we were like, why wouldn't this person just come forward and say what happened? What's the big secret? Well, he was underage, drinking. Whether his story is credible or not, it didn't matter, but he was filming something, and no one else was there. And so finally they get this wrapped up. They bring the charges against the officer, which I'm not sure. That's very rare. I don't know if that was the only time ever. No, that's rare, but it has happened before with his charges. But that the case where the jury came back and found him guilty was the first time ever in the state of Minnesota. So all this is very new. And then at the time he was charged, then the Minneapolis Police Department then fired Officer Noor at the time he was charged. But up until that time, he was being paid and was on administrative leave.
Wow.
But never spoke. The first time he spoke anything was in the jury, and he decided to take his own stand in his own defense and talking to the jurors. But this was a very strange story from the very, very beginning. And as you know, this was a woman 40 years old who was engaged to be married the following month, and simply made a 911 call because she heard what she perceived as a sexual assault or a possible rape going on in the alleyway behind her home. And so when she called, simply wanted to report it. And then they said squad cars are on their way, or a cruiser's on their way. 5 minutes went past. She called again because no one was there. No one showed up. And she wanted to ensure that someone was on their way. And by the time, then she says, "Yep, I see the lights." And then, so she called twice, and then she was on the phone, and she hung up and says, "They're there now." She was on the phone with her fiance, who was out of the country, and so she was on her phone and said that's all that, that's the last words she said to him, is the officers are here now. And then as she went out to the alleyway, the car wasn't there. It was down at the end by the street, which was 6 or 7 houses down. And she had to run down in her pajamas, and I believe she was barefoot, and then got the attention of the officers and was subsequently shot. So the unknowns here are, was there a sexual assault or was there a rape? Whatever happened to that person? That's the sad thing in this entire case. If there was a victim that night that wasn't Justine Damond, who was this victim? The testimony shows on her 911 calls that she heard someone, a woman, a female, either yelling or screaming or saying very loud the words "no, no, no." And so some thought, well, maybe it was just a couple having sex. I don't think you'd be hearing the word "no" yelled out and screamed that loudly in an alleyway. So I believe
Maybe they were
she
watching
was,
a sports game or something.
and it was loud enough that it warned her to call police. And so I believe that she was fair in her assumption, and she called in good faith. And so we don't know, and no one ever came forward as far as who that victim was or what was actually going on there. And that's the sad thing on this entire fiasco for 2 years is we never got to the root of the 911 call to begin with.
And
so
that's never mentioned here either, right?
and they've never talked about it. No one's ever come forward. We don't know what happened, and
because there are other neighbors. Other neighbors would have heard.
Yes, and this is a tight knit. The houses are pretty close together. Other people would have potentially heard this. This was in July here in Minnesota, so your windows would be open. Your windows would be open at night on a hot night like that in July. So whatever was going on, I'm sure others heard. I don't believe we have confirmation from the Minneapolis Police Department from 911 dispatch that if any others had called for this exact same reason. I think this was the only call. And then dispatch said, yep, we've got a unit, one police car going out there with 2 officers in the car, and they were told to go down that alleyway and check it out. And so when they turned down the alleyway, they went down, and I think they hit their lights, their headlights and their squad car lights, I think, were off. And so they used probably just that floodlight out in the front to look for something or somebody or, whatever was going on. But I don't, and it doesn't mention this either, but it does, I would expect, under my opinion, is that they never stopped. They rolled down that intersection very slowly, down that alleyway, and I believe they kept going. They didn't stop at the house of Justine where the caller called from. They didn't stop to ask questions. They didn't stop and get out and look around. I think they just slowly coasted down that alleyway because Justine got out, and like I said, she was unarmed in her pajamas that night and barefoot. She came out into the alleyway, and I believe it was that time that she noticed all she saw was taillights as the car was 5 or 6 houses down, and she had to chase down and catch up with it to get their attention. And so this was a long stretch, and I'll show you that. I'll show the site here as well. From where she placed the 911 call, we're talking 6, 7 houses down. She would have been either jogging or out of breath or possibly running just to catch up to the squad car. And where she caught up with the squad car, it was parked at the intersection, ready, I guess, to turn off onto the street. And I don't know if they had completed their investigation or if they were going to make a loop around and come back. But this is quite a distance away, and that's when they said that they heard a slap or something where they think that maybe she slapped the car to alert them to say, hey, I'm here, what's the deal? What'd you find? What are you doing? And so then he immediately, instinctively had his weapon out and shot her. And so we got multiple things here that I'd like to get some of your insights on here, Greg. I know that typically the person driving the squad car is just driving down, maybe handling that light, that floodlight. But would it be common for the other officer in the car to have his gun out, unholstered, maybe sitting on his lap, maybe holding it? Would he be in some kind of fear for his life or any kind of situation like that?
I would say if he was in fear for his life, he would have had his hand on that trigger. To have it, you either have it out in your hand or you don't, or you don't. But this doesn't make sense to have it on your lap. That's just the weirdest thing to me. I don't understand that.
And I don't know why the weapons would be out. They're just driving down. They were not responding to a murder. They were not responding to a gang fight. They were not responding to a drug deal gone bad. They're responding to what I would call pretty much just a domestic. And so they might be looking for someone down that alleyway, looking out the window with the windows rolled down, and may have been potentially startled. But you would think at that point they would have their either their mace or their pepper spray or something else or their taser in their hand, and if they were feeling like they were startled. But I don't understand the use of the weapon. The weapon for a police officer, it's under, I've got family, friends, and relatives in law enforcement, and really that's your last resort to actually use your service weapon. That's if your life's in danger or someone else's life is in danger is the only time that weapon should even be out. Much less, I don't know why it was even unholstered. But he had it out.
Have you asked any family, friends, or anything like that? What, like, say, is that common to have your gun out on your lap? I'd be curious to hear what they said.
No one that I've talked to said it was ever common to have it out on your lap or even to have it out. But if you're startled, the common answer is you may think you're going to go to option A, B, or C in a case, but in a split second you draw whatever's comes to you quickest, and sometimes that's that service weapon. I have heard that they do not think, okay, I'm going to get the mace out, and then if it escalates, then I'll get the taser, and then I'll go to the pepper spray, and then if all else fails, I'm going to go to the baton, and then I'm going to pull out that service weapon. So
right.
In the instinct, they'll grab whatever's there or whatever's on their mind, but that should only be used, in my mind, after watching all of these cases, if your life's in danger is when you are able to pull that out. Now, the other thing in this case, Greg, is they were wearing body cam cameras, surveillance cameras on their body that were off, and they're supposed to leave them off, and they're supposed to activate into recording mode. I believe the rules for Minneapolis police is if they're come upon a scene or if they're about to engage something or pull someone over or make an arrest, when they're knowingly going to be doing something that could be that should be videotaped, they push the button and activate that video camera. And the official rule is, I believe it's official, but it's also very loose, is that if your weapon is ever unholstered for any reason, that camera should be turned on. And so Officer Noor had his weapon unholstered, and I believe, I don't agree that he should have had it even out, but if he did have it out, he should be hitting the record button on that body cam, and he did not do that. So we've got a couple things that Officer Noor did that wasn't in compliance, I think, and some things that was not standard operating procedure, and we can chalk it up and explain it away that he was young, he was a rookie, but I would think a couple of those things right there were very common. I don't want to say common sense, but it's questionable why he did any of these actions that he took. Now, what we heard later is we never heard that Officer Harity, that one driving, had his weapon out. He never seemed to be scared. He never seemed to be frightened, and he never seemed to be considered that his life was in danger. But then we get the testimony later, which was a couple days later, that now say that, he did have his gun out, or he did have his hand on his holster, or he did have trouble unholstering his weapon. And so we get three different kind of soft stories there in this jury trial from Officer Noor and Officer Harity that leads one to suspect that maybe he did have his gun out or trying to reach for it, or if that wasn't the case, these two did have their stories lined up very conveniently to make it more reasonable for Noor to have his weapon out. And I think that's the other area of concern in a case like this is everyone's heard of the thin blue line, law enforcement, the brotherhood of law enforcement that will do what they can to support and back up their fellow brethren, law enforcement, even if it means doing something illegal or committing a crime itself. They will do what they can to back up and to show support. So I don't believe
like Shannon Barnett.
So we had two cases with this. Now Harity seems to be just an innocent driver driving down, handling this floodlight, and now we get later in testimony that he was also trying to fiddling around with his holster, trying to get his gun undone. And so that means now that both of them had fear or suspected fear of their life, that they had a need to use deadly force. The other thing is there was Officer Noor said that he was startled at the beginning, and that's why he had it out, because he thought he heard a gunshot or something else. Now, the first couple of days that went by in the news here in Minnesota, neighbors thought they heard fireworks, and they thought someone was lighting off fireworks that time of the year in middle of July. That's probably what startled him, and that's probably what it was that got him startled, and I think he wanted to use that as the excuse after he, did what he did in shooting the woman, saying later that, hey, I was startled. I was thinking we're going to be ambushed. I was thinking that it was a call and something else was going to happen, and our lives were in danger. And so this comes to play, this goofy fireworks story, which gets even worse yet. 3 days later, Greg, we hear in the news for the very first time that both officers believe that the squad car was hit, slapped, punched, or something that made a large, startling noise that got them both freaked out. And so the testimony of the trial, just from this last week, the police chief said, I never heard anything about anyone slapping the car at all, and it was 3 days later. And so wouldn't you say that right away at the scene, say, you know what, we got nervous, we got scared, we reacted improperly because someone slapped the car. Now, we do know that Justine Damond, Justine Ruszczyk, I think would have been her other name, she was traveling down that alleyway, either in a jog or a walk, a quick walk, walking fast, or maybe even running. And to get the officer's attention, maybe she did slap that squad car. Maybe she did slap that back of that SUV police car to get their attention. Now, that could very well be true, but it also seems like that was a contrived statement to lend to additional belief for the public, to say that, you know what, Officer Noor did have it was reasonable that he pulled his weapon. It was reasonable that he shot. Now, what they did in the investigation, they took fingerprints of that entire squad car. Handprints, palm prints, fingerprints. They also had Justine Damond's fingerprints, palm prints, handprints. And there was over 100 fingerprints on that squad car, none of which were Justine Damond's. So when that piece of that issue hit the jury trial, I was talking to some other friends. They said, that kind of hit home for me when I heard that. That more than likely they made up that story. The squad car was more than likely never slapped. It was never hit. It was never pounded on, and they were never startled. So now it seems, allegedly, that they blamed her for startling them, made themselves the victims, and said, hey, we just reacted responsibly to a threat that we deemed this person as a threat because she slapped that squad car so hard that we decided to fire the weapon. So that's not true. It probably wasn't even fireworks. It was probably something that he was saying.
They could tell the difference. They could tell the difference between fireworks and somebody slapping the car.
So that's the odd thing, and I think that's how we got the unanimous decision from the jury to convict on the two charges. Now, the charges for those new to the case is he was charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and third-degree was a second-degree manslaughter. Three charges were brought against him, and the jury came back and charged him with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, and they did not find enough to evidence on that second-degree murder. But still, that's two charges out of those three, and like I said earlier in the broadcast, that's the first time ever a Minnesota active law enforcement police officer was charged with murder while he was on duty. So this is huge. This is big news that this is even going to happen, because that's going to put him away now in prison, 9 to 15 years, 7 to 13 years, something in that range. And that's not going to be a very good environment for someone in law enforcement to be hanging out there with the general population or the gen pop in prison. And so what are your thoughts on that?
That's a long time. That's a long time to be put in prison. Because I was looking at that, and I was watching some Australian show, and they were talking about, what the minimum. They said the minimum is probably about 9 years, if he's good and all that stuff. And the maximum, I think you're right, it was like 13 to 15 years. They tried them separately, or they had three different charges just to make sure that one or two stuck, I guess. So I was really happy. I want to make sure that he at least serves 9 years at the very least, because I've seen this stuff happen where he's supposed to serve so much time and all of a sudden he gets off. Now with this other civil case, I highly doubt that, but I was shocked about that. But I think you're right. That is the big smoking gun. Is they say that she banged on their car, and that's not true. They had two police use of force people who looked into it, and both said that no, there's no fingerprint. Just like you said, no fingerprints, nothing there. You have stories changing, but then you have other cops. This other sergeant who turned her body camera off too, multiple times from what they say. I don't understand that. So I don't know.
Just to clarify for the viewers out there, and once again, please leave your comments below on this video. What happened was the officers in the car, like I said, had theirs not activated. But what they did after the shooting took place and they got out and were trying life-saving efforts and CPR on this poor woman, they turned their body cams on. So once again, all we see is the goodwill of these guys doing what they can to save this poor woman's life, and that's all captured on film, but they don't have the wherewithal to turn it on during the shooting. Now, you're right, the sergeant shows up, and I think it was the police sergeant on duty that night, and some other officers showed up, and they were asking what happened, what went on, and those officers, I think several of them, then activated their body cams, and then a few minutes later deactivated them, and in a couple of instances they turned them back on again. Now, that police sergeant who showed up, I don't know, after showing up on a scene like that, if you'd have a need to have your body cams on in the first place, much less, like you said, turning them off and then on again. But when it was on, it did capture one of the other officers telling Officer Neuer, you better keep your mouth shut, don't mention this to anyone, and keep your head down. You stay quiet. And so that was captured. The other one says, I think it was captured, what the hell's going on here? What happened? Why is there a woman bleeding on the street? Did she have a weapon? No. So they were going back and forth with trying to figure out what happened. And so she died there on the street, and all she had in her hand, I think, was a cell phone that she had either maybe put in her pocket or maybe was in her hand. But some also say that maybe if she raised her cell phone or raised her hand with her cell phone in it, it could have glistened or it could have been shiny. The officers could have, perceived it as a threat, something in her hand, possibly a weapon. But others say no, that was in her opposite hand, or it was in her pants or in her pocket. So it wasn't even out to have that found as a threat. So whatever they did, he shot. Now, we also don't know why he shot over in front of the other officers, right over in front of his ear, in front of the officer's head.
That's the biggest one. The
whole thing is very, very bizarre as far as why any of this would even happen. But being from Australia, that whole, the news articles in Sydney and Melbourne were covering this case huge.
They've done a great job.
They've done a great job. And so, like I said, I went down there. I'd laid some flowers at the spot, and then I took my car and drove the next day with my camera, my cell phone on, down that alleyway, just to show the difference of that. And if anyone out there want to watch that, there's a video called, and I just called it the July 21st update on Justine Damond murder. And it's out there. I've given the location of where the site took place. And then I show the video footage of if anyone wants to see what it looked like at that alleyway, driving down that alleyway. Now, this is at night. But now this is also...
Are the houses close?
The houses are close to each other. It's at night, but it's also in a very good neighborhood in Minneapolis. There are some very run-down, poor neighborhoods, and there's some neighborhoods that are, have problems with prostitution, drugs, drug use, criminal activity. This neighborhood is not that type. This is more of an upscale neighborhood. So these two on the scene there, these two on patrol that rolled down this alleyway, I don't believe, out of the nature of their working in this precinct, would have been fearful of their lives as far as some of the other neighborhoods in Minneapolis. This is This is a very good area. So I'm going to leave that link on this video as well to
Yeah,
show
people should watch that.
what
People
that
should
looks
watch
like. And
that.
it's just a 7-minute video that I did 2 years ago and posted it out there. But it shows the, once again, the site, the alleyway site. And then the other thing I wanted to mention in this video is after this happened, Facebook, created a friends and concerned neighbors, I should put it that way, created a Facebook page, an actual page called Justice for Justine Damond Ruszczyk. And there's an image there that says, "Why did you shoot and kill our neighbor and friend?" And so they created a page. There is 1,700 people like this. 1,700 people
Wow.
are following this page. And there's very good information out there as well, because most people just wanted to know what happened. And with no one talking, the officers not talking, the attorneys not talking, nothing talking, no one still had options, at least for closure. This is the first week now that we've had closure in this case at any level of the extent of this entire thing. The trial went on for three weeks, I believe, and we got further information of for the most part, what happened, but no real answers. And so the jury came back, found him guilty on 2 of those 3 charges, and now just this day, today, is when we get the settlement of the civil court. And I'm showing an image now of I just did a screenshot today, Greg, of if I just did a Google search on Justine Damond civil case, and here's the articles that come up: the $20 million settlement that the city awarded to the family, and that was in all of the news today. And so it's a separate thing. We have the criminal case that was finished on April 30th, and now today's May 3rd. The civil case was
$20 million.
$20 million. And so for the listeners out there, the family sued with their attorneys. They sued the city and the law enforcement, the city, and Officer Knorr and I think Officer Harity. I think they brought the defendants. There was 4. The city of Minneapolis, the police department, Officer Knorr and Officer Harity combined were sued for $50 million.
Oh my goodness.
The lawsuit
Wow.
was 50, and this thing could have drug on for many weeks in and out of the court cases. And what surprised me today when I popped this up on the news is that they settled already for 20.
Wow.
And so it leads me to believe that the city wanted to get this off their back. The police department wanted to get this off their back. They came to an agreement for 20, and it sounds to me like they said, "Let's do it. Let's get this thing over with." And so that's still a record.
So where does that 20 come from? And so they're not. Oh no, it's a settlement, so nobody's gonna fight it. But where does that 20 million come from?
And here's what I think. Now, I'm not in the legal profession, and hopefully we can get answers on the YouTube here below this in the comment section. But I think that 20 million it's simply been awarded to the family, and what they're going to do is give 18 to the family, and the family is going to use 2 million of that to set up a what do you call it? Not a scholarship, but I don't know if it's going to be a park or something, a city, something in the city. A scholarship or something for the city in remembrance of her. Now, you said where the money comes from, and so the losers here of this case, which is the city and the police department and Officer Knorr and Officer Harity, together have got to come up with that 20 million. And typically a police department will have an insurance policy for something like this, that they'll be able to get that money paid out. The city will have an insurance policy that will enable them to get money out there, for instance, like this. And then I think when it comes to those individuals named with Harity and Knorr, I don't think that there is insurance for that case. And typically what you'll see from their portion that they owe, you'll see that in the form of garnished wages in the future for when they work. They will have to pay back that, what I call it as restitution, essentially. But they'll have to fund that. They may have insurance for something like that, or maybe the police union has it for the individuals to help. But they've got to come up with 20 million some way, shape, or form between all four.
Can they claim bankruptcy or anything like that, or no?
I think that we would see down the road.
Maybe they can just buy the whole city and just run the whole city. Sounds like.
So that's the case. All we heard today in the news was just the settlement, and now how they're actually going to make that payment work. That could take weeks or months to get all that together, and I don't know if they come up with a plan, a payment plan. Is there installments over a 3-year period, 5-year period, or is it all up front, just dumped in the form of a check? I don't know that, and hopefully we can get people to answer that. But that is a large amount. The previous record in the city of Minneapolis for a civil case that involved a law officer was $4.5 million.
Wow.
So this is 20. So that's why it's making the news here. First time ever an officer convicted by a jury while he was on duty, and a historical $20 million lawsuit. And this goes to show that, like you said, justice can happen. We can get justice for things like this, and it goes to show that someone ultimately has to pay the price for a mistake. I think it's fair to say that Officer Noor didn't do this on purpose. It wasn't premeditated. He didn't look at the color of her skin and then decided to shoot. I think it was a reactionary measure, and he just instinctively did it. But in the past, what we've seen is that these officers have gotten off. They've gotten off, and no one's had to pay the piper for situations like this. And now what we see here is Officer Noor paying the piper and being held accountable, and the city and the police department. So it's at least good to see something like that come out of a case like this. But like you said, it's 2 years. It's coming up on 2 years later. That did it need this whole thing? Did it need to take this long? Did we need to get all of the lawyers, attorneys involved to do this? My question is, could Officer Noor have come out the next day and said, "Look, I'd like to do a public press statement release to the family, press release saying I'm sorry, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to do it, but obviously I did it, and let's move forward with this." Did he have to remain silent? Did he have a need to get an attorney and shut this whole thing down? Was he hoping to get out of it? Was he hoping to weasel out of it somehow and not be charged at all? Who knows what goes on with thinking here, but
and it's probably not just him, because he was a very special case, right? So it's like the people who helped him become a cop, it's going to look bad on them too, right?
Yeah,
I know we've covered
he was
that
part of that
last year.
program too. Minneapolis, because of all the Somali nationalities and immigrants here in the city, there was some program that encouraged those with a Somali background to get into law enforcement and to hold positions throughout the city in different various forms of positions. One including they're trying to hire more Somali national background police officers, and I believe he was the very first one of that program to become an officer. So programs like that were meant to do good are meant to be a positive reflection in the city are the things that get hurt, because that thing was shut down, I think, right away. They're no longer going to even go forward with that program anymore. And whether, who knows? But things like that how you get one person can wreck it for all the rest. And this is a case just like that has the domino effect is huge on a case similar to this.
I had one question that I had here, and I know we don't have this answer, but one thing that I was thinking of that I just wrote down: did these cops ever pull their guns? I'd be curious. You said they were there for about 4 years, right? They've been on duty for about 4 years.
Both those officers together, I think it was 4 years. I think one was 2 or 3 and one was 1, so a total of 4 combined. So not a lot. And the officer that I talked to says typically when you get 6 years under your belt is when you start making your best, most informed decisions as far as spur of the moment. When you see these shootings and things like this, he said, look for the length of years on the service, and if it's less than 6, that's typically when you see these knee-jerk reaction kind of things. Go ahead.
Which is probably why it's good to have not too inexperienced officers.
Well, that's the other
but
question.
You can't always plan for that. Right?
Why were they paired up that way? That's the other question. And once again, this was a nicer neighborhood. The other thing I have here in my notes is that they really went down the avenue of the ambush in the notes. Listening to the jury testimony from both Harity and Noor, Officer Noor. They said, we've been trained to how to respond to an ambush, a potential ambush, where if someone's out to get us and call us on 911 to get us into the area on purpose, then to ambush and take us out. So they really pushed that angle too, thinking that maybe that will help soften the blow as far as did we use reasonable force? And I don't think the jury bought into that as well, because there was nothing there, nothing to indicate an ambush, nothing to indicate a potential ambush or a threat of an ambush at all. So that gets interesting.
And so we really don't know how often that these two cops had pulled out their guns. This might have been their first time that they've ever pulled out the gun.
Well, here's what we know for Noor. When this first thing went down, they did check his criminal past in this whole thing, and he didn't have a record or a clean record. But on 2 previous occasions after becoming a cop, he did pull his weapon out on, I think both cases were unarmed cases, where he pulled his weapon out and aimed it. One of the cases was pulled someone over for a traffic stop, and for whatever reason, his weapon came out and it was pointed at the suspect's head for a traffic stop, and that was Officer Noor, same guy. And then for something else, he had his weapon unholstered another time. So I think this was his 3rd time in a year. And Officer Harity, I don't believe they pulled any of his history. I don't think it probably wasn't even warranted to pull the history of him, because he did essentially nothing wrong. But Noor he's had a background, not a criminal background, but he had aimed a service weapon at someone's head in the past.
And do we know how long these two cops have been working together? Do they always work the same shifts, or is it kind of random, everybody switches off?
I would guess that with partners like this, they typically work their same shifts and together.
Okay.
So in a case like this, they may have been on a 3-month rotation or a 5-month rotation, or they had worked, I think for a good part of that first year, these two were partners, is what it sounded like to me.
Okay.
Yeah, it would be good to get who else was Officer Noor's other partners in his 1 year with the department, and see what they thought of him. And perhaps it only was Harity, but Harity worked with them the longest. They had a pretty good rapport, it sounded like.
And speaking of him, nothing's going to happen to him. He was never charged with anything. The other cop in this, right?
Correct. Nothing charged. Now, we do know that these a couple.
He should be charged with a cover-up at this point, or lying.
That's where it gets goofy, because he's now connected to that slap on the squad car, thinking it was a potentially an ambush narrative that we know is probably not true, and then the narrative of he had his weapon either out or on the verge of getting it unholstered because he too feared his life was in danger, which is also not true. So he went along with a narrative here that not just one, not two, but 3 things that were kind of squirrely in his testimony. And so he would be, I'm sure, reprimanded or disciplined somehow. And he was named in that civil case as well. But I don't think he'll be terminated or fired or face any disciplinary actions himself. But as a younger guy, this probably escalated so fast, he probably tried to do what he could to help out his fellow officer, and so it would have been nicer, I think, for the entire scenario if he would have stepped forward and said, you know what, I'm going to separate myself from this from my partner and do a press conference or a letter to the office, to the department or something, and saying, you know what, here's what really happened. I'm not going to back this guy up. I don't know what he was doing. I don't know what he was thinking. But there was no threat, and here's what happened. She calmly approached the car, and before we knew it, my officer decided to shoot. You know, he could have thrown Officer Noor under the bus if he wanted to.
Sure.
If he wanted to be a truth advocate to get it out, because we could have the answer the very next day. If he would have released a statement saying, here's what happened, my partner's an idiot, I admit he made a bad decision, but I had nothing to do with it. But instead, he went down the road of compromising himself a little bit to say that both were kind of on the same wavelength. So I think that's what draws some of the suspicions and raises some of the eyebrows with the public when he starts making statements like that that aren't entirely true. And I think the jurors saw through that, and when they came to their conclusion, is what I think.
Yeah, makes sense.
So what else did you think about the case? Anything else that came to mind, the circumstances? Oh, the thing that I didn't mention that I want to make sure I get in here quick is the other strange, which may not be strange in law enforcement community. When the shooting like this took place, they found her identity and find out where it was that she lived and the home that she called from on that 911 call. And the very next day, and maybe 2 days later, that they went right away to get a search warrant to search her home. And people, the neighbors, family, and friends were very offended by saying, why would you need a search warrant to search our home? She's the victim. She did nothing wrong here. And so there was skepticism by saying, folks thinking, were they trying to find something on this search to say to implicate her? That was she involved in, something that they could somehow pin the blame back on her? So that did not sit well here in the Twin Cities area when word got out that they went and got a search warrant to go into her home. And now talking to a law enforcement friend of mine said that's actually very common to tie the loose ends because they don't want to miss anything. They want to cross their T's and dot their I's on this entire investigation. And so they kind of have to do that. But that seemed goofy, I guess.
And that's the same with doing a toxicology, right? Just to make sure she didn't. I mean, it would matter if she had drugs.
Yep, she didn't have anything in her system. But I think they did on the autopsy is they test to see if there's any drugs or alcohol in her system. And people are offended. Why would you do that? But sure enough, they also want to rule out the fact that maybe she was on something. Maybe she was drunk. Maybe she was acting disorderly. But the test came back, and that was not the case. Yeah. She taught. I think she was a yoga instructor. Something to that effect. Very healthy, in shape. Her and her husband did a lot of exercise work and things like that. Holistic kind of thing. And they were about to be married the very next month. And so, and then it was a blended family. I think she had a child from the first marriage, or maybe he had a child from the first marriage. But the two had didn't have any kids together, but their wedding was supposed to be the following month.
It's very sad. The whole thing is really sad. And he hasn't been sentenced yet. He's going to be sentenced on June 7th.
Correct.
So what does that mean?
And so that's the sentencing now portion of this. So we got the conviction, we've got the what he was convicted of, and now the judge now gets to go back and look at the framework and the benchmarks to see for a third degree murder and a second degree manslaughter charge, what the low end sentencing would be for that and what the high end sentencing would be for that. In that case like that, they will look into the person's criminal background to see if they should be at the higher end or lower end. And I don't believe Officer Noor had any kind of a criminal background, so he'll be at the low end of the sentencing guidelines, I think. And so they get a month to go through that to see what would be appropriate, and then the judge during that sentencing would do that. Now, at the end of the trial, when they made the conviction, I think they do get the option of letting that person appear for jail the next morning on their own, or the next day, or later that afternoon, or they have the chance to put the cuffs on them right there with the bailiffs and haul them out. And so they made that decision also to say, you know what, let's put the cuffs on and take him out while he was still in his navy blue suit, and take him out directly to jail that very same day when they announced the verdict. Now, they didn't have to do that, but I think everything was under a microscope in this case, that they had to make sure everything was done correctly so you wouldn't get the blowback from the people not happy with the results. So they had to do everything, I think, correct, because we get this whole race thing, we get the whole religious thing. It was Muslim, the Somali, the Australian, the white versus the black. Who knows what was all going on. So they made the announcement, and then it was 45 minutes later, I think the county attorney Mike Freeman came on and had a press release also with the family to get everything squared away. I think they were fearing too a case like this. It could have been a potential Ferguson with the officer Darren Wilson and Michael Brown. Was there going to be protests? Was there going to be fires? Was there going to be chaos in the city that they had to prepare for once this verdict was read also? And so none of that happened. None of that
Thank
I've
God.
seen. Nothing like that went on at all. It seemed to be very orderly how this has gone down, in my opinion.
Well, that's great. That's how it should be. This is how these cases should be handled. I hope other people can look at a case like this and use this as a blueprint. That's what I hope. People will learn from this. This is not a black and white thing. This is not a racist thing. And I heard that too. It's like, oh well, if this was a white cop who shot a black woman, blah blah blah. It's like, you know what? Let's not even look at that. Who cares about race? Take the race out of it. Just look at the circumstances. Because most of these people who are always talking about race, we shouldn't focus on race, all they do is focus on race. Here is a clear case that has nothing to do with that. And yeah, certain people are going to try to capitalize on that, the black versus white thing. But I'm so happy that there wasn't any riots, that we're not hearing a lot of stuff. And maybe it's just because I tune a lot of it out. But I'm very happy with the way that this case turned out. Obviously, nobody wants a person to have to die, but I do believe that justice was served, and I'm very happy with that. And I'm just so happy with all of the people that were involved to make that happen. All the family, all the friends, all the people who kept pressure to make sure that justice was served. That's what you do for your family. That's what you should do.
Correct, and I think you said it best. No one was going to win in this case,
Right?
Because everyone's already losing. The question is justice served and is justice carried out, and I think it was. And so that's the main point. I think the thrust of this entire case, and I was pleased the way that it turned out. But no one's going to win. There's no winners here. It's an ugly thing and it's an ugly situation, but it is what it is, and I'm just glad it worked out. Greg, do you have any other final thoughts here on the broadcast tonight?
No, I think that's it. We covered everything.
Yeah, it certainly was an interesting 2 years with all of this going down, but I thank you for your time tonight, Greg. This was a good overview to put this entire case, I think, to bed. And like I said, please, for the readers, the listeners here, leave your comments below in your questions and things like that. And if you want to, you can go ahead and watch that other video that I did, 7 minutes. It gives the cam version of the using a phone driving down that alleyway, and you can put things into perspective from the distance of where this took place. And like we said earlier, the was the real victim in this case, the sexual assault victim, or the rape victim, that we have strangely never heard anything about in the media, news, or police as far as what happened. That was the thing that instigated all of this, was Justine Damond doing the right thing and making an honest-to-goodness call in good faith about a neighbor in distress. All right, for Greg Fernandez Jr., this is Dan Hennen. Today is May 3rd, 2019. This is the episode of the officer-involved shooting with the Australian woman killed. Thanks for listening.